On this week's Lazy Sunday upload, I'll again tap the wisdom of Douglas Murray. When it comes to topics of immigration and integration, especially as it affects the European continent, he seems to be one of the few that talks honestly about the challenges facing Europe. The following has been cut from an Intelligence Squared panel discussion held in February this year. The topic was, "Don't give them what they want. Terrorists should be starved of the oxygen of public debate." The idea being that the media gives far too much airtime to terrorist attacks, which I actually agree with. I think the media focuses a disproportionate amount of time on the actual attacks, but doesn't spend nearly enough time on discussing issues such as immigration and integration. Some argue on this panel that we shouldn't draw links between terrorist acts and immigration and integration issues. After all, the London attacker was born and bred in the UK. But it's hard to see how you can treat them as separate and distinct when the common theme running through them is Islam. Now, in these short clips I show here, Murray points out some of the ways the media's role in these issues can be detrimental to the overall debate. Now, the full discussion and Q&A runs for about an hour and 25 minutes, and I've linked that below if you'd like to see the full show. So here is Douglas Murray.
Is there an argument to be made? We've heard President Donald Trump come out and say, we're not covering terrorism enough. And to all of us who work in news, I think we were like, you must be taking the piss, was probably the first reaction. Yeah. And then they provided this list of, various attacks in Europe, many of which, in fact, we hadn't covered because they were incidents where maybe one person was stabbed. And because the threshold is probably quite high at this stage for it to become leading a news broadcast. But
you didn't do enough on Sweden, did you?
But do you think there's an argument to be made on the other side that we're not covering it enough, that we're trying to sanitize it, that by not showing the images, as you said, that by not sort of, going over every single incident?
Well, can I, firstly, the press already, the media already does a fair amount of editorializing before you even get to the discussion we're having. Let me give you one example. ISIS, which is the subject of Fawaz's book.
Thank you.
If you'd like to hold it up again. No, I've got a 10% deal on this. ISIS now the main broadcaster here in the UK, the one that we all pay for, the one that is, I think, responsible for the fact that our media is not as divided as it is in, for instance, in America. There's much to be said for the BBC. The BBC chose to not use that term. It's so-called Islamic State, as the BBC. Well, that's an editorial decision it takes about the group. I've often said, I keep on hearing the BBC called the so-called Islamic State more times, I'll put my so-called shoes through the so-called television. But it's an infuriating editorial decision, which they've taken before you've even got to reporting the story. That's why you can speak to a lot of people in this country who, despite this, what we're talking about here as being an over-coverage, still have very little idea of what it is that ISIS wants. Because we actually don't have a lot of that discussion, because our broadcasters and our press don't want to have a lot of that discussion. And so we go round and round on the pornography of violence. I'd much rather we had those bigger and deeper discussions that meant that people knew what was actually going on with this group, what they actually want, and what groups like them want. But just very quickly, I've got to pick up as well on this mention about Sweden, if I may, because this actually does get to a core divide that's going on at the moment. I do not enjoy the bifurcation of American media, I have to say. I don't like the fact that increasingly these are two sides talking about each other, but never to each other. And I think it's enormously regrettable for democracy as a whole. That said, there is a specific problem which the Sweden story actually talks to. Now, as it happens, I've just finished a book which Fawaz will be, by agreement, promoting any moment. No, which comes out in May. But it's about the migration crisis in Europe. And I've been spending quite a bit of time in Sweden, among other countries. And there are, now it's not terrorism on a daily basis, but there are so many societal problems that have broken out in Sweden in the last few years. And you very, very rarely see anything about it in the press and the media in this country or in America. And I think that what happened in this is emblematic of a problem. So the media doesn't cover the story. Okay, you could say, well, who cares about Sweden, or it's just, it's just this. But the fact is that it's the non-coverage of that, of a very serious story, and then a sort of cack-handed reference to it by the American president that is responded to by the liberal media saying, ha, 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 it's so hilarious. Sweden's just this wonderful place where everyone's just doing IKEA stuff all the time, is a horrible, horrible deepening of the divide.
Douglas itching to just
very
get in
quick,
there.
it's slightly off the topic, but just it reiterates the point I was just trying to make, which is that an absence on one side creates something on the other. And this is a very good example. I said it for a long time. If your entire media says that Islamic extremism has nothing to do with Islam, you will create a movement that says it's all to do with Islam, and all Muslims must be involved. In the same way as if you pretend that no migrant into Europe is ever going to be anything other than the most brilliant PhD student, you will create a movement that says they're all terrorists. I mean, that is part of the problem.
We are talking about terror through a lens of terrorism that happens to white Westerners. And Douglas, you asked the question earlier, like, how would we stop it? And I think the simple answer to how we stop it is that we do appear to stop it whenever it happens to Muslim people, brown people, black people. Look at what happened in Canada. And I know it's very easy for us all to say, nobody changed their Facebook profile to a Canadian flag and says, Je suis Canada. But we need to have that discussion. Why are we as the media complicit in not covering terrorism that happens to people of other faiths?
Or
I mean, if I may just make 2 points on this very quickly. One to the lady up there. I mean, I don't think we should beat ourselves up too much about the coverage of terrorist attacks that have a proximity to where we are. This always happens after a terrorist attack now. You'll say, why, as far as says, why have you got so much attention on Paris and less on Beirut? It's because Paris is Paris and Beirut is Beirut, and Paris is near us, and most people feel more kinship, and they've probably been to Paris, and more people have been there than they've been to Beirut. I mean, you can always play this game. It's regrettable, but it's not only us, in our country that feels like that. When something happens near you, it's of more import to you than if it happens far away, and sadly, the Middle East feels far away for most people, and so of course that's going to be the case. We might regret it, but it's not unnatural that's the way in which the things are covered. Secondly, on this thing, as it were, about motivation, there's another thing that happens now after any terrorist attack, which is it happened recently of what was it? There's a sort of graphics that gets sent around Facebook, social media, Twitter, all that kind of thing. The number of people killed each year by, I don't know, lawnmowers versus the number killed by terrorists. Everyone has a great chuckle. You're more likely to be killed by your toaster than you are by and that also that also sort of skews the whole debate, because I don't deny those stats in certain countries. By the way, they always tend to be things like how many people have been killed in America by terrorism since the 12th of September 2001?
Six
that
people.
Sort of, no, yeah. But the point is that this. But this is so you don't. It always starts from a certain date that helps the statistic, as it were. Because if you did it 24 hours earlier, you've got to put in 3,000 more people, and so on. Same with Paris. They don't pass around the Paris death toll statistics on the same amount because they're not as sort of giggly for a bit. But again, I don't deny that a toaster can be dangerous or a lawnmower. But if there were a movement deliberately making dangerous toasters, or deliberately miswiring lawnmowers to make sure they kill their owners, I'd want to know about it, and so would you. And that's what we're dealing with, movements that actively want to do this. And so, of course, there's a disproportionate emphasis on that, because that's what matters. Another very interesting point of this phenomenon and the complexity of where we are in it. Look at what became the picture of the year at the Press Awards ceremony the other day. The photograph of the assassin of the Russian ambassador in Turkey standing over the body of a man who was who was alive only seconds before, standing over that. Now that was all over the press, and we had no problem with it. It was a dead Russian on the floor by a live, heated. And when you consider that the British press has no problem doing that, but absolutely, pardon my French, needed to change its trousers over reproducing a cartoon a few years earlier. you realize the sort of craziness that we're in.
Yeah.
You know, you're taking your life in your hands if your publication publishes a cartoon, but everyone's got the dead body of the Russian everywhere.